Naya and Canon Winters were the picture of perfection, beautiful, successful, and deeply in love, but behind the spotless facade of their suburban life, a dark and twisted secret was brewing, one that would shock their quiet neighborhood to its core. What happened when the perfect couple's carefully crafted world began to crumble? This is the chilling true story of betrayal, murder, and the lies that ultimately shattered everything Naya and Canon Winters were, the epitome of success in their quiet suburban town. To anyone who looked from the outside, they were the perfect couple. Their home, a charming two-story house on Maple Street, was immaculately kept. The garden was a burst of colors, every spring with roses climbing up the front porch and ivy trailing along the walls. Their driveway was always empty of clutter. The cars parked perfectly aligned as if it had been staged for a magazine photo shoot. Everything about their lives seemed polished and effortless. Naya, with her striking features and poised demeanor, was an interior designer known for her taste and attention to detail. She designed her own home, transforming it into a modern masterpiece with subtle touches of vintage charm. Her business was thriving, and she was often praised for her talent on weekends. She could be found attending local events, hosting brunches with friends, or volunteering at charity functions. She always seemed to have a smile on her face, a welcoming presence that made her beloved by everyone who met her. Canon, her husband, was equally admired. A successful lawyer, he had a reputation for being both brilliant and charming. His colleagues often refer to him as a man of integrity, someone who always took the high road even when others didn't. His work schedule was demanding, but he made time to show up at school events for their two children and was often seen socializing at the local country club or at attending fundraisers. The Winters family was the ideal that everyone strived for: happy, prosperous, and well-loved. They had been married for over 12 years, and their relationship was the stuff of fairy tales. Canon and Naya were often seen walking hand in hand at local parks, laughing with friends over dinner, and sharing intimate moments at family gatherings. Their children, a son and daughter, were well-mannered and excelled at school, completing the picture of a perfect family. But something about their picture-perfect life never sat right with a few people in the neighborhood. A few neighbors, particularly those who lived nearby, couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't as flawless as they seemed. There was something too perfect, too polished about the Winters family. The way their house was always so pristine. The way Canon always looked so perfectly groomed. His clothes never a wrinkle out of place, as though he had stepped straight out of a magazine. And Naya, who was beautiful and poised, but who sometimes seemed tired or distant when you caught a glimpse of her, when she thought no one was looking. It was a Friday evening, just like any other, when the first small crack in their perfect image appeared. Naya and Canon were hosting a dinner party at their home. Their guests marveled at the elegant spread and the sparkling chandeliers. The conversation flowed easily, and everyone seemed to be enjoying themselves. But just after dessert, something shifted. Canon's temper flared over a trivial comment made by one of the guests. His face flushed red, his words sharp and cutting. Naya, usually the calm one, suddenly became quiet and withdrawn, her smile tightening as she fidgeted with her wineglass for a moment. The tension in the air was palpable. It was brief, just a flash of something unsettling. But it was enough for a few guests to exchange uneasy glances. They brushed it off, thinking it was nothing more than a fleeting moment. But little did they know that it was the first sign of a much darker story, unfolding behind the closed doors of the Winters home. What the world saw was a perfect couple with a perfect life, but behind the gleaming exterior, secrets were beginning to stir, and the cracks in their facade were about to widen in the days that followed. The dinner party, things between Naya and Canon seemed to take a turn for the worse. The once vibrant energy that had characterized their home now felt muted, as if a cloud had settled over the house. Neighbors started to notice subtle changes. Naya, who was always an enthusiastic presence at community events, suddenly became a ghost of her former self. She stopped attending the book club meetings she had once organized and began to decline invitations to social gatherings, citing work or family commitments. Her friends grew concerned, but no one dared to ask too many questions, afraid of overstepping. Canon, on the other hand, became increasingly absent. His lawyer's office, which was located just a few blocks away, kept him busy, but he no longer made an effort to be home for dinner or family activities when he did appear. He was often aloof, buried in his phone, or lost in thought, as though his Mind Weasel's, where his charming exterior remained intact, but something about his interactions with Naya felt strained, like a script that no longer fit the actors. One evening, a neighbor named Ruth, who had lived next door to the Winters family for years, saw something unusual. It was around 9 p.m., and she was in her kitchen washing dishes when she noticed Naya standing in the driveway, visibly upset. She was pacing back and forth, her face flushed, her hands wringing at her sides. Ruth peered out from behind the curtains and could just make out the faint sound of raised voices. Cannon stood a few feet away from Naya. His posture, rigid arms crossed, the conversation appeared heated, but Ruth couldn't make out the words. Ruth watched for a few minutes, wondering if she should intervene, but then, just as quickly as the argument had begun, it ended. Naya wiped her eyes, straightened her blouse, and gave a forced smile, a smile so practiced it sent a river down Ruth's spine. It was the kind of smile you put on when you're hiding something, when you want to convince others that everything is fine, even when it's not. The tension between the couple seemed to dissolve almost instantly. As Naya made her way back inside the house, and Cannon without a word got into his car and drove off the next day, Ruth saw Naya again. This time she was alone, in the front yard trimming the hedges, but her movements were stiff, her face pale and drawn. Ruth smiled at her from across the street, but Naya didn't return the gesture. She simply nodded, a faint look of weariness in her eyes, before turning back to her gardening. It wasn't long before Naya's behavior became even more erratic. The house, which had once been spotless, began to show signs of neglect. The lawn was overgrown, and there were piles of unopened mail gathering near the front door. The windows, always sparked now, looked slightly foggy, as if they hadn't been cleaned in weeks. It was as though Naya had lost the energy to maintain the life she had so carefully curated. Cannon, for his part, remained elusive. He spent more time away from home, taking late-night calls, or disappearing for long stretches, leaving Naya to handle everything on her own. Their children, once a joyful presence in the neighborhood, seemed distant as well, withdrawn and quiet, not their usual playful selves. A few neighbors whispered that they hadn't seen them out playing in the yard in over a week. Despite the changes neither Naya nor Cannon ever spoke of what was happening, they kept up appearances in public, attending church on Sundays, and continuing to host occasional dinner parties, but the warmth had faded from their interactions. The cracks in their marriage, once hidden beneath the glossy surface of their perfect life, were now starting to show. And what was most disturbing was the feeling that something dark was simmering beneath it all, something neither of them was willing or able to confront. It was the growing tension, the subtle signs of distress that made everyone in the neighborhood uneasy, but no one knew just how deep the secrets ran, or how dangerous the truth would be. When it finally came to light, the facade of the Winters family was crumbling, but it would be months before anyone truly understood why. The tension between Naya and Cannon only grew as the weeks passed, but the cracks in their marriage were carefully concealed from the outside world. While Naya withdrew further into herself, Cannon seemed to double down on his public persona, throwing himself into his work and maintaining the illusion of a perfect life. He had become a master at hiding his true emotions, his charming smile never wavering even as his marriage spiraled out of control. It wasn't just the neighbors who were starting to notice the subtle shifts. Naya's closest friends began to worry. Sonia Mitchell, a longtime friend who had known Naya since college, tried reaching out several times. At first, Naya had been quick to make excuses. Work was overwhelming, the kids had activities, Cannon had been busy, but Sonia knew her too well. The excuses didn't quite add up. One evening, Sonia decided to pay Naya a visit, determined to check in on her. She rang the doorbell, and after a few moments, Naya answered, her face pale and drawn. She smiled weakly, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach her. The house, usually a picture of organization and elegance, felt empty, as if something vital had been drained from. "I've been meaning to call," Naya said, stepping aside to let Sonia in. Her voice was quieter than usual, as if every word required effort. "It's been crazy lately. I'm sorry. I've been out of touch." Sonia could feel the unease radiating from her friend. The air in the house felt thick with unspoken tension, and as they sat in the living room, Sonia couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The conversation stayed light at first, talking about the kids, the weather, the latest neighborhood gossip. But it didn't take long before Sonia's instincts kicked in. Naya was distracted, her eyes constantly flicking toward the hallway as though she expected someone to appear at any moment. "I'm worried about you," Sanya said finally, her voice low but firm. "You don't seem like yourself. You don't have to. Pretend with me." Naya's expression faltered for a split second. The mask of calm slipped, and Sanya saw the pain in her eyes, a flash of something deeper, something hidden. But before Naya could speak, the front door creaked open, and Sanya heard the familiar sound of Cannon's voice. He called out a greeting, and Naya's face immediately brightened, the mask slipping back into place as if on command. "I've got to get dinner started," Naya said, standing quickly. "But it's so good to see you, Sanya. We'll talk more soon." Sanya could tell the conversation was over before it had truly begun. She smiled, but it was forced. She knew her friend was hiding something. But the moment was over. As she left, Sanya noticed Cannon standing in the doorway, his smile tight and unwelcoming, his eyes cold. There was something about him that unsettled her, a hardness behind his polished exterior that didn't sit right. Over the next few days, Sanya tried to reach out again, but Naya never answered her calls or texts. It was as though she'd disappeared into thin air. Sanya's concern grew, but there was nothing more she could do. She was helpless, watching from the sidelines as her friend seemed to slip further away. Meanwhile, in the days following Sanya's visit, the atmosphere in the Winters house only grew more oppressive. Naya had become more withdrawn, and Cannon's behavior had taken a darker turn. He was no longer just distant. He was almost cold, his once loving demeanor replaced with an edge of irritation, as if everything Naya did annoyed him. One afternoon, Ruth, the neighbor who'd witnessed the argument in the driveway weeks earlier, noticed something strange. She was outside gardening when she saw Cannon leaving the house again. This time with a suitcase in tow, he placed it in the trunk of his car and drove off without saying a word. Ruth thought little of it at the time, but something about the sight left a nagging feeling in her gut. Days passed, and still there was no sign of Naya. Her car sat in the driveway. The lights inside the house remained dim at night, and the yard grew untended. Ruth, unable to ignore the growing sense of unease, began to pay closer attention. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, but no one else seemed to notice. It wasn't until a few weeks later, when Naya's absence became impossible to ignore, that the first real signs of something darker began to surface. The neighbors had begun to gossip. The kids had stopped playing. Outside the house felt like a ghost town, but no one could have predicted how quickly things would spiral into a nightmare, or how the secret that Cannon and Naya had been hiding for so long would finally come to light. Weeks passed, with no sign of Naya. At first, the neighbors assumed she'd simply taken off for a short getaway. After all, Cannon had made a point of telling everyone that Naya needed a break. He explained it away with practiced ease. She was stressed from work, overwhelmed by family obligations, and had gone to stay with a friend out of town. No one questioned. But as the days turned into weeks, the mystery began to unravel. Naya's absence grew more conspicuous, and something felt deeply wrong. The neighbors hadn't seen her at the local grocery store or out for her usual morning walks. Her car, once parked in the driveway every night, was now always absent. Cannon, who had been so charming and polished in the past, began to look more and more disheveled. His smiles grew colder, and his excuses for Naya's disappearance became more rehearsed, more distant. Then one fateful morning, Ruth, the neighbor who had witnessed the argument in the driveway months earlier, made a startling discovery. She had decided to check on the Winters house again, her gut telling her something was off. She walked up to the front door, knocked, and waited. No answer. She tried the doorbell, but the house remained silent. A nagging thought crossed her mind. Was anyone even home? It wasn't like Cannon to be gone for this long, and the emptiness of the house only made her more uneasy. It was then that Ruth noticed something unusual on the side of the house near the garage. She saw an old wooden door that led to the basement. It was slightly ajar. Ruth had never noticed it before, but now it caught her attention. She peered through the small crack in the door and felt a shiver crawl up her spine. There in the dim light, she saw something that didn't belong, a discarded suitcase covered in dust and left haphazardly against the wall. Her heart raced. It didn't take long for her to piece things together. Ruth remembered the day she had seen Cannon leave with a suitcase in the trunk of his car. Was That the same suitcase, and if so, why was it now sitting there abandoned with no explanation, unable to ignore her suspicions? Ruth decided to take a step further. She called the police. Providing them with what little information she had, the officer who answered was polite but skeptical. At first it could be nothing, he said, but agreed to send someone by to take a look. Ruth's stomach churned as she hung up the phone. She wasn't sure what she was shopping for, a misunderstanding perhaps, but she had a feeling that Naya was in danger, and Cannon knew more than he was letting. Later that evening, Detective Sarah Carter arrived at the Winters house. The neighborhood was quiet as she approached the front door, her sharp eyes scanning the area. Ruth, standing nearby, gave her a brief account of what she had seen: Cannon's odd behavior, the suitcase, Naya's prolonged absence. Detective Carter, experienced and pragmatic, knew that this was more than just a simple case of someone needing a break. She had seen enough to recognize the signs of something darker inside. The house felt strangely cold despite the warm warmth outside. Detective Carter went straight to the basement. It was there, in the dim, cluttered space, that she discovered something that would change everything. Hidden behind a stack of old boxes was a large black trash bag. Inside, when she carefully opened it, was Naya's lifeless body. The sight was harrowing, but it was the way she had been positioned, arranged with chilling precision, that made Carter's blood run cold. It was clear that Naya had not left willingly. She had been murdered. The discovery sent shockwaves through the quiet neighborhood. Ruth, who'd simply been trying to help, could barely believe what she had learned. Naya, who had once been so full of life and ambition, had been taken from her family in the most violent way possible, and the man everyone had thought so perfect, Cannon, was hiding the truth right in plain sight. But the question remained, how had it come to this? What dark secret had been lurking beneath the surface of the Winters' seemingly flawless life? Detective Carter knew this was just the beginning. There was more to uncover, and she was determined to get to the truth no matter where it led. What she didn't yet realize was just how twisted the web of lies and deception was, or how deeply Cannon was involved in his wife's death. The discovery of Naya's body in the basement marked the beginning of a terrifying unraveling of the life that Cannon and Naya had built. The once perfect couple, admired by everyone who knew them, was now at the center of a horrific investigation. Detective Sarah Carter took charge of the case. With unwavering determination, the evidence was shocking. But there was still so much to uncover, and she knew that the real story had yet to be fully told. Cannon was arrested late that evening, his arrest coming as a jarring shock to the neighbors who had always seen him as the perfect husband and father. When the police arrived at Hishi's office to take him in, he remained eerily calm, his demeanor almost too composed. Cannon offered no resistance. Ash was read his rights and escorted into the back of a squad car, his silence wasteling. But it wasn't enough to confirm his guilt. He maintained that Naya had simply left him, and when she hadn't returned, he had assumed she'd gone away to clear her mind. The police, however, knew better. Detective Carter began to piece together the details of the couple's troubled marriage. The cracks in their relationship had been growing for months, perhaps even years, but it was clear that Cannon had not simply been a neglectful husband. He had been living a double life. As the investigation deepened, new evidence came to light that painted a darker picture of the man who had once been seen as the town's golden boy. Through phone records and surveillance footage, investigators uncovered the truth of Cannon's affair with Rachel Monroe, a woman who had once worked at his law firm. Cannon had kept this relationship secret from Naya, but Naya had known for months. In fact, it was revealed that she had been collecting evidence of his infidelity, planning to confront him with it when the time was right. But Cannon had anticipated her move. The affair wasn't just a betrayal of Naya, it was a time bomb, one that Cannon feared would destroy everything he had worked for. As Detective Carter dug deeper into the couple's financial records, it became clear that Naya's life had been slowly spiraling out of control. The Winters' finances were far from perfect. There were large withdrawals from their bank account, hidden assets, and several unexplained transfers. Naya, who had always been the picture of grace and control, had become suspicious of Cannon's sudden erratic behavior. She had started to suspect that he was not just cheating on her, but hiding something far more dangerous. But it wasn't just the affair that pushed Cannon over the edge. It was the fear of losing everything: the family, the status, the image of perfection that he had worked so hard to cultivate. When Naya had confronted him about his betrayal, things had quickly escalated. In a fit of rage and panic, Cannon had snapped the murder was not premeditated, but in the heat of the moment, it had become an irreversible act. He had killed Naya, the woman he had once loved, and hidden her body in the basement toy himself. Thanks for watching True Crime Cases.